Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com. Greetings from the Overflow Room. Today, I want to talk about ideal romantic string quartets, the ideal list. And this list is ideal in several respects. First of all, it's going to give great performances of the works. But even more important than the performances are the works. Because you know, people who are hardcore collectors like moi, and many of you also, we kind of want more and more and more, always more and more and more, and complete things, and boxes of stuff, and unusual composers, and undiscovered repertoire. I mean, that's one of the great joys of record collecting, and frankly, of classical music in general, because it's this sort of endless galaxy of stuff, some of which is very well known and some of which is not. And it's kind of fun to look into the odd corners here and there and make exaggerated claims about the things that are less familiar. It increases our self-worth. I mean, who are we kidding? The more crap we know, the smarter we think we are, and the more we have one up on either the other guy or on received opinion. That just comes with the territory. It's part of the rewards of getting into it and spending all of this time that we spend listening to stuff. But the fact of the matter is that if you're just starting out, and this really is a talk for you, you don't need to go that far. And if your interest in certain corners of the repertoire is more casual than serious, you don't need to go that far. And you're not really missing anything in the sense that there truly is plenty of fabulous music by certified masters that's undeniably great and fabulous, and you can be happy just with that. And so for this talk about romantic string quartets, I mean, the romantic period, or let's just say the 19th century after Beethoven, right? So Beethoven died in the late 1820s, right? Was it 1827, something like that? So there was plenty of the 19th century left. And there were tons of string quartets being written, lots of them. But the fact of the matter is, the ideal list of string quartets consists of 19 works by 5 composers. And that's it. That's really all you need to know to have a really wonderful selection of string quartets from this later period. And frankly, 19 works is a lot. Even that's a lot of music. 5 composers, if they're really great composers, that's a lot of music. And because of Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven pouring most of their greatest thoughts into the medium of the string quartet, particularly Haydn and Beethoven, if you get these 19 works, you have some very serious listening to do. Some really profound stuff that's going to keep you busy for a very, very long time. You don't have to go, out of the circle, the charmed circle, and find all this other stuff, unless you really, really love the composers in question, who wrote more than what I'm going to talk about. Some did, some didn't. And string quartets generally, the medium, the style, the what it is. Because, otherwise you can make yourself crazy. And I think it really becomes very, very intimidating. I mean, it's bad enough we have to do romantic symphonies and romantic overtures and tone poems and operas and oratorios and you name it. There's so much music. And in chamber music, there's piano solo music, there's sonatas, there's violin sonatas, there's trios, there's quintets and sextets and tets all over the place. So you're really going to be very, very occupied. But you really ought to have a good selection of string quartets. And so that's what this talk is going to provide for you. A post-classical look at great 19th century string quartets. And that's all. Absolutely, that's all. So we can talk about these works when you all comment as you will. Please do not talk about what's missing, because I have a very keen sense of what's missing. Believe you me, here behind me is a lot of what's missing, and I am leaving it out for a reason, because the point here is to allow you to focus on the truly great works that will give you the core of a superb quartet collection of later works after the classical period, and allow you to enjoy those, and it will give you all the direction you need as to what you're going to hear and what you might encounter if you go further. And you'll have the experience necessary, and hopefully the love, which is the important thing, the love for this absolutely extraordinary music. So, let's get hopping. After Beethoven, the first truly great quartet writer we need to deal with was Schubert. Now, Schubert wrote like 15 string quartets, some in pieces. You know, Schubert, his life was a mess. And when he died, everything he left was a big pile of stuff. And it had to be sorted out and organized, and there were complete works and incomplete works and early works and some late works. Late works by Schubert, by the way, only means he wrote it before he died when he was like 28 or something like that. So there isn't really no late Schubert, but there is mature Schubert. Let's call it that, shall we? And they are extraordinary pieces, absolutely unlike anyone else's. Incredibly beautiful, melodic, and I don't know how else to describe it, sometimes spooky or soulful or spiritual or spacey. They're unlike anything else anybody wrote. And the ones you need to get are the late ones. And my recommendation for the 4 late quartets, because this is very easy to get, is the Quartetto Italiano, which is a wonderful group, on a Phillips twofer. There are lots of groups that have done these works and done them excellently. So if you can't find this used to be on Phillips, it's now on Decca. The Quartetto Italiano recordings are sort of going in and out, but they'll be back. I wouldn't worry about that. But you can get 2 single discs with the same stuff on them. You can get them together as a twofer. There are many, many fine performances of them, and I will talk about all of these works separately. They are all going to be the subject of future discussions. And so you don't have to worry also about not getting the necessary depth, if that's what I offer as depth. I don't know, at least more verbiage about them. But get the last 4 Schubert quartets. They are, first of all, there's number 12 in C minor. That's called simply the Quartet Satz. That's German. That means quartet movement. A movement is a Satz. Believe it or not, a Satz is just a chunk. It's a single movement that Schubert wrote and then never followed up on. And boy, it's one hell of a movement. It's great. Then you get numbers 13, 14, and 15. And some of them have nicknames, which is very, very helpful. Let's see. 13 is nicknamed Rosamunde. 14 is Death and the Maiden. That's the really famous one. And 15 is 15. That's all. Just number 15, the last one. The nicknames come from the fact that the quartets quote themes from Schubert's songs. And the most famous of the songs is, of course, Death and the Maiden. In their slow movements, slow movements, generally speaking, are variations that take a tune from the song and use it as the subject of the variations. But these are extraordinarily beautiful works. You must have them, and they should set you off on a very productive path toward exploring romantic string quartets. You know, it's very interesting because, you know, Schubert's life essentially was that of Beethoven's. I mean, that is, his entire life was encompassed by Beethoven's life, even though he was much, much younger, because he was only in his late 20s when he died in the 1820s. So, I mean, Schubert's actual years, let's see, were 1797 to 1828. So how old was he? Oh, he's 31. Yeah. He made it longer than I thought. But, you know, 31 years old, terrible, terrible tragedy. But he just poured music out, and he left these late quartets. Everything was published posthumously. And it's really quite an unbelievable story when you think about it, that he was just somehow within himself generating all of this music and writing at high speed. We don't even know how much of it he heard sometimes. You know, he actually heard, and he just left this pile of manuscripts for people to sort out later. So these are extraordinary works. And Schubert, because his life was encompassed essentially by Beethoven's life, can be seen in some respects as the last gasp of the classical period, but also as a romantic. Certainly as a romantic. And I would argue that in these late quartets, we see the flourishing and birth of Romanticism, not only in the use of song themes and stuff like that in the slow movements, but in their overt emotionalism and their willingness to seemingly burst the bounds of classical forms in the service of immediacy of expression. They are extraordinary works, and I really hope that you get a handle on them. Get some, give them a listen, spin them around, and see what you think. So Quartetto Italiano is my choice, and off it goes. Next, probably the greatest quartet writer, as a writer of quartets, after Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, was, at least in the first half of the 19th century, was, believe it or not, Mendelssohn. Now, Mendelssohn wrote 6 quartets. Actually, there's more. There's an earlier one, and then there are some quartet movements, but 6 numbered quartets. They are among the greatest creations of 19th century chamber music. They are still underrated, really underrated, tragically underrated. They are unbelievable pieces and wonderful for people who are just getting into string quartets. Why they are not more popular or better known, I can't imagine. They are fabulously expressive, tunefully melodic, incredibly constructed. They basically do everything a quartet is supposed to do in a reasonable span of time. Mendelssohn was a quick composer. His basic pace of thought was fast. His basic tempo selections are usually zippy, so that there's no boring stuff in the Mendelssohn quartets. They never bog down. And the first 2, numbers 1 and 2, which were written in reverse order and published, as usual in classical music, if you see something numbered 1 and 2, then 2 usually came before 1. It just works out that way. These quartets are some of the most profound and formally interesting pieces any composer did in this period. They're amazing, amazing works. Mendelssohn was one of the few composers who admired and understood late Beethoven, particularly the late Beethoven quartets, which are still difficult works today. For a lot of people, I mean, they're not easy. Mendelssohn understood them, understood the formal innovations that they represented, and he took that and, chewed on it and digested it and spit it back out in his own personal terms. So numbers 1 and 2 are amazing. The middle ones are a bit more on the classical side formally, that is the classic 4-movement form of the normal string quartet. And the last one, the F minor, number 6, which he wrote after the death of his beloved sister Fanny, is one of the most scarifying, tragic pieces of music anybody ever wrote. It is gripping. It is a drama. It's unbelievable. It's almost expressionistic. It's terrifying. It's absolutely amazing. Amazing, amazing music. I am going to play you the opening, and this is my preferred set. This is the Pacifica Quartet. It's fairly recent on CD Records. It is an amazing, amazing set of records, and the sonics are just unbelievable, incredible. Let's listen to the opening of the F minor quartet. It tells you right away that we're in for a wild ride. that is the piece to play when people say, well, string quartets are boring and they're emotionally kind of cool and they're all about intellectuality and formal perfection. Ha! Nonsense. Play this thing if anybody has any doubts. But the Mendelssohn Quartets, the 6 Mendelssohn Quartets are absolutely mandatory, and they're going to be such a discovery if you give them some time and really don't rush. I mean, the quartets rush. You don't have to rush. Now, don't worry about, you put them on and casually listen. You have to sit down and focus. And boy, are they rewarding. And take your time and absorb them. They say wonderful, absolutely amazing, amazing things. There was this famous pedagogue. His name was Hans Keller. He lived in the UK, he worked for the BBC. He was a refugee from Nazi Germany. He was a string player and trainer of string players and string quartets. Benjamin Britten dedicated a quartet to him. He was somewhat trained kind of by Schoenberg. He was out of his mind, completely out of his mind. He wrote a book on Haydn string quartets. But Hans Keller, who really knew a thing or two about quartets, even though he was completely crazy, said that after Beethoven, there were only 2 composers who wrote string quartets. Real, honest to goodness, true, authentic, perfect string quartets. One was Schoenberg, whose quartets are not on this list today. And the other was Mendelssohn. And when you listen to Mendelssohn Quartets, you get a sense of what he's talking about, because the expression is immediate, but there's also that formal element, that perfection of balance and craftsmanship, and the joy in working with the string quartet medium. So much for the Mendelssohn Quartets. No, seriously. One of the things about string quartets, it's one of the great misunderstandings about string quartets, and this is something Keller pointed out, and he's right, is that a string quartet is not supposed to be a perfectly balanced dialogue between 4 equally balanced voices. It can be, but what it really is every possible combination of those voices. So it will have solos and duets and trios in every combination. And the great quartet writers understood this and managed to include in their works a great variety of texture. Lots of variety, lots of color. That was what Haydn, the great, incomparable Haydn, understood about quartets more than anybody else. There is always a tendency in later composers who, after Beethoven, got very, very nervous about string quartets, just as they got very, very nervous about writing symphonies. There's a tendency to overwrite, to give too many people too much stuff to do at the same time, to allow, too much contrapuntal working constantly. You've got all these voices always vying for each other. The result can sound excessively thick and excessively dense. It's really very, very ironic when you think about it, because you only have 4 players, and you think to yourself, well, it's chamber music. How complicated can it be? In the sense that, there's only 4 players. It's not like you have a big orchestra going crazy. But the truth is, string quartet writing musically, in terms of musical lines, can be as thick and impenetrable as a fog of music. And some composers fell into that trap. They fell into the trap of feeling that everything they did always had to be necessary, with every note always balanced against every other note, and everyone always having something meaningful to do at all times, with the result that the music sounds kind of tiring and monochrome and difficult. And the composer who wrestled with this more than anybody else, and his success was debatable, was Brahms. Believe it or not, Brahms wrote 3 string quartets. They are undeniably, from a musical point of view, on paper, extraordinary works. They're not his most beloved works of chamber music. Brahms was more at ease writing chamber music with piano, or like Mozart too. He had the same issue in some respects in his last quartets, where he got so interested in just writing for everybody that sometimes the texture itself is uninteresting in its overall impression, and the music sounds unnaturally thick. Ironically, composers like Brahms and Mozart were much happier when they had quintets and sextets, that is, more players. And those works for more players, first of all, can have a natural richness of tone that the composers dearly loved. They love big, succulent sounds without straining, without forcing all four players to be doing something all the time. It's natural when you have some extra players. There's an extra guy. You can have an accompaniment. You don't have to worry so much. You could relax a little bit in works for larger forces than they felt they were able to relax when they wrote quartets. And so the Brahms quartets are tough pieces in terms of his chamber music for a lot of people. Now, I have friends who adore the Brahms quartets, and they are lovely. They have wonderful tunes. They're shapely. They're reasonable in length. There's nothing about them that would seem to be difficult. But somehow, once you get done with one, the impression you may have is that there was too much going on all the time. It's a very subjective impression. You may not have that impression. It's one that I got, and I know a lot of very serious Brahms scholars who sort of agree with that they're not his greatest chamber works, but they are very important works. And Brahms, who was nothing if not conscious of the historical realities, that supposedly wrote dozens of quartets in his life that he destroyed before allowing these three to be published, the three canonic Brahms quartets. So they are undeniably polished, polished to a fairly well, and seriously great music. But are they enjoyable music? Do they give you pleasure? Do they have that immediacy of emotional expression? Well, I bring them up here in my ideal string quartet list because I want you to ask yourself that question. I want you to listen carefully, to listen sympathetically. You know it's not going to be time wasted. It's great music. Will it hit you? Will it impress you? Will it make you want to come back? I have no idea. But you have the right to decide. And that's the point. I don't want you to be intimidated. It's okay not to like the Brahms quartets. And that's why I'm bringing this up. There's music you're going to like. There's music you're never going to like. You may be one of those people for whom these quartets are extraordinary right from the start. It happens. But you may be one of those people who finds that they leave you cold. That's true of all of this music. But in these quartets, I think the issue is crystallized in a particularly compelling way. And so my choice for the Brahms quartets is the Alban Berg Quartet. Now, these are on Teldec. Teldec is now part of Warner. They've all been stuffed into a huge Alban Berg Quartet box on Warner, which used to be EMI because the rest of their stuff was on EMI. So you can find these possibly still separately. There are, again, many, many fine performances of the Brahms quartets. You don't have to stick to the ones I'm telling you. These are not going to be so special that someone else doesn't hit you equally powerfully. But what I like about these performances is that they do have that sort of sharpness of focus and the textural clarity that prevents the music from sounding too heavy and too thick too soon. That's what I think these performances really have going for them. But these are the quartets you want to test your quartet listening prowess with. And that doesn't mean you have to like them. It doesn't mean you're going to like them. You may come away saying, he didn't know what he was doing with quartets. And as far as you're concerned, you could well be right. But they are great pieces and definitely part of a basic, ideal romantic quartet collection. And off they go. There's a bed over there. Don't worry. They're all having a happy landing. So after Brahms, we leave Germany. And some of you may be awfully glad that we leave Germany because the quartet also had quite a life in then Czechoslovakia, the Czech lands. Boy, there's some great quartet writing going on there. And it's quite different from the German quartets in some respects because the Czech composers had a very, very keen sense of instrumental color. So they took these quartets and added a whole new dimension. There's pizzicato, there's ponticello, there are string effects in the way that they get played. They're enlivened by Czech folk music. The counterpoint is a little bit less rigorous sometimes not. And you find, and also the interesting thing about Czech music is that, Germans' concept of sonority, and boy, somebody should write like a treatise on this, it tends to be lower and darker. I don't know why. It just does. There's a certain darkness. Well, maybe historically too, to the German concept of sonority, and so the quartet sonority is sort of rich in the middle sections. Czech music, for reasons I also have no idea, tends to be higher and lighter and brighter. If you look at orchestral music, this is quite obvious. In Czech music, you find lots of piccolo on top and higher strings, and it tends to be more open and airy sounding, maybe more of a sense of the countryside, maybe because of the folk music influence. It could also be because of the greater influence of Italian music, which is also lighter and brighter. The influence of Italian opera, the absence of the Wagner tubas and that heavy dark sonority that German composers tended to prefer as the 19th century wore on. I don't know, but it's a fact. It's an audible fact. So the first great composer of string quartets in the Czech tradition was Smetana. Smetana, the guy who wrote My Country, the Moldau, Ma Vlast, Vltava, which is the Moldau in Czech. Smetana was an opera composer, first and foremost, which may also contribute to that higher mean sonority, because his model for opera was Italian opera. It was not German opera. It was not Wagner particularly. And so his two string quartets are extraordinary pieces. The first is subtitled From My Life. It's autobiographical. It has a terrifying moment because Smetana went deaf and he had a persistent buzzing in his ears. And boy, can you do that with a string quartet, especially if you're not afraid to write high E's. I mean, or the note that he couldn't get out of his head before he went insane. He had syphilis. It was a whole story. But the From My Life quartet, it's got a polka, it's got dance stuff, and this terribly tragic moment in the finale, which is humming along, and then all of a sudden there's a dramatic tremolo and the piercing tone, and then sadness is the result. It's really a deeply tragic work, but also a very theatrical work. It shows the influence of Smetana, the opera composer. It's dramatic in an overt way. And that quartet, that's his number one, is so popular that number two is completely ignored, but it's just as great and just as colorful and absolutely fabulous. So if you know the first quartet, you got to hear the second, and it will be a real discovery for you. They always come coupled together. Well, not always, but easily come coupled together on a single disc. This is Smetana played by the Smetana Quartet. This is the Denon recording. It was released in Japan. It's still around if you have Japanese sources, but it was a co-production with Supraphon. And so it's also available on Supraphon Records. It's the Smetana played by the Smetana Quartet is just one of those musical events. If you can get it, get it. If you can't, there are a bazillion Czech quartets that play this stuff fabulously. There's the Pinocha Quartet. There's the Stamitz Quartet. There's the Pavel Haas Street Quartet. There's just lots and lots of great Czech quartets. There's the Janáček Quartet. They're all named after Czech composers mostly, and they are great. Absolutely great. So, Smetana quartets, you got to have them. Absolutely got to have them. Finally, last but not least, no collection of romantic string quartets would be complete without the greatest quartet composer in the second half of the 19th century, who was unquestionably Dvořák. Dvořák wrote 14 string quartets and a whole passel of other pieces for string quartets, and they are terrific. Some are early, some are immature. They're not all equally great, but at least 7 or 8 of them are unquestionably great. And The earlier ones, some of them are fascinating, important works, starting really with Quartet number 4, probably, which is an amazing work in one movement. He extracted the notturno for string orchestra from that quartet. It was the original slow movement. You know, Dvorak was a string player, which really helps when you're writing quartets. You know, Brahms was a pianist. That may have been one of his issues. It makes a difference. You've got to know your string instruments, you know. And Beethoven, of course, was a pianist, but he also played the violin, believe it or not. He knew his string instruments. Haydn, too. He composed at the keyboard, but he played the violin and the viola. Mozart played the viola. All of these guys were sort of dual musicians, and Dvorak was one of those. He was a violist by training and profession, but he also played the organ. He was a church organist. He played the piano. I mean, you know, these guys were musical geniuses. They could do anything, basically. And the Dvorak quartets are a world unto themselves. I have done a talk already on the complete Dvorak quartets, where I recommend sets. I recommend the Pinoca quartet for the complete Dvorak quartets on Superfun. But if you're going to limit yourself, we're talking about limitations here. We're talking about just the essentials, painful though it may be. You need to have four Dvorak quartets. You need number 10, which is known as the Slavonic, and then numbers 12, 13, and 14. 12 is the American quartet, which is amazing. And then 13 and 14, which are his two last quartets, which are late works in the way that Beethoven quartets are late works. Profound, deeply felt, totally non-programmatic in intent, but no less affecting for that. They are the glorious, glorious gems, crown jewels in the string quartet literature of the 19th century. So I've chosen two discs here. This is the Stamitz quartet. The Dvorak quartet on Praga. If they're still available, I have no idea. It makes no difference because, again, the Dvorak quartet performances were amazing when I reviewed them. And I say these things not so that you run out and get exactly the ones I recommend, but because, if they're not available now, they'll come back. Everything is going to be around. And if you're watching this talk in the year, 2573, by then they may well have been reissued. It may not be a problem. Or you could find them digitally and download them. But like I said, there's the Pinoca quartet. There's this guy. There are these guys. There's plenty of excellent performances of these late quartets. Many, many groups have undertaken them. The American quartet, number 12, is one of the most popular quartets ever written by anybody. Every quartet does it, whether they're Czech or not, and you don't have to limit yourself to Czech quartets. The Juilliard does it. They're fantastic. The Takács quartet does them. They're fantastic. There really are just so many fine quartets out there. In fact, if you find a group whose sonority you like, whose way of playing really appeals to you, go with them in all of this music if they've recorded it, because these are the quartets most likely to have been recorded by every string quartet that makes records. They've done most of this repertoire, or they will have done most of this repertoire in the course of their careers. These are the ones that quartets play. So, and that you see live and that you're likely to hear on the radio. And, they're the really popular ones. So the famous ones, not always popular because chamber music by definition is not always popular, but it is famous or highly regarded. So these Dvorak quartets with the Dvorak quartet are exceptional. And if you get them, you will love them. I am pretty damn sure you will love them. And they make wonderful contrasts with, for example, Brahms in terms of sonority, in terms of style, in terms of the way that the composers write for the string instruments. One thing about quartets, people say that quartets, off they go. People say about quartets is that they are essentially a player's medium. That, the string quartets are designed to be enjoyed by the four people in a room. And as listeners, we are eavesdroppers. But we can't possibly get the same satisfaction as people who actually play them. And I agree with that. You can't deny that. You can't say that the person who's playing it is not getting a satisfaction that the person who's listening is not getting. That's self-evident. Someone's playing it and someone's listening. Two different activities. That doesn't mean that as listeners we can't get quite a bit of satisfaction on our own and are entitled to our own satisfaction as well. But what I mean by that is that, you know, these pieces really do offer a certain intimacy that's really unique. And composers treated them that way. You know, it's not that there's something inherent in four strings. What's inherent is or not inherent, but what was accepted is that when a composer wrote a string quartet, he was doing something important, musically important and highly personal and deeply significant, and he wanted to do his best work because a string quartet in some respects leaves you exposed. You really have no place to hide when there are only four strings. You don't have much time for useless padding. You don't have the opportunity to drone on pointlessly. You can't, you know, excuse your lack of inspiration by using fabulous orchestral effects or adding a glockenspiel or harp glissandos or, you know, other things to distract the attention of the listener. You're not going to be imitating, at least as much, things like, you know, thunderstorms and other sounds of nature and stuff, although you can, and some have. If you listen to my talk on Reicher's Quartet Scientifique, you may have heard a work there that actually has a thunderstorm in the middle of it that he attached to it. You can do all kinds of things with string quartets, but the medium itself encouraged a certain profundity, I guess you want to call it, a depth of expression and a purity of musical expression. It encouraged composers to always place the most musical values and technique at the forefront of whatever the music is. And as I said, there are many other fine string quartets in the 19th century. And I mean, there were composers who wrote single quartets like Grieg, for example, or Franck. And there were Saint-Saëns wrote some quartets that are lovely. Tchaikovsky wrote quartets. Lots of composers wrote quartets. And you may well want to branch off and hear some of those quartets. I left out Schumann's quartets because, you know, in spite of beautiful things, they are not considered to be among his greatest chamber works compared to his chamber music with piano. You know, this is a subjective choice, I understand. And you may well have favorite works as well. But if you get these 19 works, I assure you, you will have the nucleus of a truly great quartet collection, and there will be plenty and plenty more to listen to and for you to explore at your leisure. But like I said, don't rush. Take your time. Get to really know this stuff. Don't just acquire it like you want to have more stuff, like the overflow room here. Seriously, like you just want to have like a box of everything. Take your time, please. Take your time. I can't say that often enough. The music rewards patience above all. We need to have patience in this crazy world in which we live. This is a wonderful time, especially during a pandemic, to sit down with your quartets and give them the time and attention that they will reward. So with that, keep on listening, folks. Enjoy your romantic string quartets. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.